But look at, not all is lost, because through the 20th century, the Irish agriculture, which I suppose ought to have been what the land question was about, though like that it was about tenure rather than technique. Irish agriculture was in the doldrums. But just as having said that, and I probably said that in the 1980s and 1990s, whereas I could drive from Galway to Dublin and never see a cultivated field on either side the whole way over for 130 miles. But all of a sudden, whether it's to do with the economic collapse or whatever, Irish agriculture is on the up and up. And it may be, bizarrely, one of the ways that can get us out of the current jam. We have to think, in other words, that these matters are not sort of fixed, they're shifting. And there's a sort of a kaleidoscope which the historian has got to keep in view. Just constantly give it a twist and a shake to see a different pattern forming. So the land question does have a certain unity about it, but it's neither obvious nor straightforward, but it does, I think it will withstand what you might call investigation. Let's leave the land. Let's look at another theme which I think a big deal of, because I think it's pretty important. And I make it a big deal because as I read the literature from the time of St. Patrick on up to the very present actually, I'm struck by the theme of movement of peoples. That is, people moving into Ireland, whether it's St. Patrick or Coroticus, the British general who comes at the same time, whether it's the monks leaving. We've had Columcille going off to Iona, we've had Columbanus going off to the Vosges, we've had the Irish monks out in the 8th century, we have the colonists coming in, we have the Vikings coming in, colonists then, the English colonists in the 12th, 13th century coming into Ireland, and then successive waves coming in with the plantations of the 16th century, 16th and 17th century. And we have the exodus of Ulster, by and large, Ulster Presbyterians in the 18th century. We have the transplantation to Connacht in the mid-17th century. And then, of course, in the 19th century, we have the annual hemorrhaging of the Irish population. 10 million leave Ireland from 1845 to about 1910, 1920. Absolutely astonishing number. And that train runs on, come independence, civil war or whatever. It just runs on, and in the 1950s it reaches a peak which threatened to absolutely sink this country because the replacement rates were not there at all. And if we move on to the 1980s and 1990s, in the 1980s there was a massive exodus of young people especially, different from the 1950s immigrants in that these were young people who had, by and large, were much better educated, very often had a degree, unlike in the 1950s. That ceased in the 1990s, the early 21st century, but that has resumed again, I think, as a result of the economic downturn. On the other hand, as during those decades, 1990 to 2010, we've had several 100,000 workers from Poland, Lithuania, whatever. In other words, the swirling around of people into Ireland, out of Ireland, within Ireland, I think that in some way constitutes one of the key movers of Irish history. People trying to get to grips with the way the world is shifting. Ireland's geographic position is pretty fundamental here. Up until the discovery of the New World, it's the last spot on Earth for Europe. After the discovery of the New World, it's a jump-off point for the New World. Now, the implications of that have got to be looked at, and maybe this is an area, a time when history failed to turn. But there is a certain geographic point to that, and the migration, emigration, and in-migration and so on. The movement of people as a theme is one which gives Irish history a great sort of oomph to it, and I think it's one which I spend a lot of attention on. I'll give you one example of what I'm trying to say. What I say is that in the 19th century, Ireland was not a society that had emigration from it. Ireland was an emigrant society, which is very different. An emigrant society is a society which is built, structured, and pointed in only one way: a painless and expeditious disposal of surplus population, with the connivance of family, priests, shipping lines, and emigrants who have gone away. Other countries have emigrants. People leave Portugal, people leave Italy, people leave England and go elsewhere. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, US. Only Ireland, as far as I can tell, has a society which is based around exiting a significant proportion of its surplus population. And that is tied into the land question, obviously, in terms of inheritance and all the rest of it. Okay, another theme. What I like, and because I'm a political historian, there's no point in me saying any otherwise. Most of my writing is about Irish politics, 18th century, 17th century or whatever. I like the notion of a parliamentary tradition in Ireland. Because one thing that strikes anyone who looks at Ireland is that, you know, by and large, Ireland perhaps ought to have gone the way of Portugal or Poland or Hungary or Spain. You know, they've had their civil wars, we had our civil war, but the generals never took over here. And that could not perhaps have been predicted. And I think what does seem to prevent that happening is that there is, in the genes, so to speak, but I mean that very loosely, a respect for parliamentary form, representation, and for democracy. Laterally, that is. So that while independent Ireland was set up, and Northern Ireland were set up in the aftermath of World War I, so too were a number of other countries, which quickly buckled into military dictatorships, and our fascist dictatorships as well. And Ireland did not, even though we like to think that Duffy and co, or O'Duffy, sort of constituted a fascist movement, probably hugely exaggerated. It didn't happen. And I think that means that particular attention has got to be paid to the meetings of the Irish Parliament from the 14th century, the way that people sought to get a majority in Parliament, perhaps not too scrupulously, and how that worked out during the 18th and even into the 19th century, where there are large representative meetings. O'Connell is big into having representative meetings where the Catholic question will be discussed and the petition drawn up and so on. So that's sort of, I think, taking the long view, that's something which I like to try and keep front and central through the book. Economic development. I'm not an economic historian, but what I will try to do, and what I have tried to do, is to keep sort of how people lived and their costume, their customs, their culture to the forefront, to try and give that adequate space so that people will understand how things change from time to time. The notion of Irish economic development is, of course, as we know, a fairly recent one. That is, for several hundred years, from the literature, the notion was of poor Ireland kept poor by wicked England. And you know, a generation of scholarship has gone into disproving that yes, Ireland may have been underdeveloped, but Ireland did develop from time to time, and that war and adverse circumstances turned it around, and poor decisions, and so on and so forth. I end really with the fallout from the Celtic Tiger boom. There was a boom in the 1990s, which I think, generally speaking, was a good boom. And then there was one post that, the development-led one, which was absolutely catastrophic. Institutions that were a byword for prudence turned out to be like ill-run casinos. And obviously Ireland is in a very bad place economically. If I say that it's not as bad as the famine, I'm not being flippant. If I say it's not as bad as the Black Death, I'm not being flippant. But you know, the idea of when you write a long history, you do get to get a sense of the long view, rather than it's this day, this month, last year. You get a longer perspective, and I think it helps calm things down a little. Okay, so where are we at? Ireland's not like England. This goes without saying. For an English historian, English history, the history of the English people, straightforward. There's national unity, there's an English people, everything runs along very simple lines. There's no movement in England to divide England from the 12th century on. Of course there's civil wars and all the rest of it, but it's about getting hold of the levers of power. It's not about breaking up the country, it's not about war to the death or anything of that sort. The English historian has it easy. The Irish historian does not. Is the history of Ireland about the Irish people? Is there an Irish people? We'll have to sort of get to grips with that. We just can't ignore the people we don't like or disagree with. You've got to try and keep them in play. And that makes for a much more difficult national history than our friends in England would have. And of course, we have the Irish abroad. If you're writing a history of Ireland, I think you have to keep an eye on what's going on with the Irish in Australia, the Irish in the US, the Irish in Britain, very often forgotten. But that they're part of the history of Ireland, because the Irish people are everywhere, post-1850 at any rate. And that has to be done. So the whole notion of writing a history of Ireland poses fairly serious problems. And trying to find patterns, which you must find. You can't just say, I just write it as it comes, you know, one thing after another. That doesn't work, that won't work. You've got to try and fit the material into some sort of patterns which seem to make sense over long periods. Some themes come and go. I don't see any reason why we have to say, this is the one, and it works for the whole 1600 years. I don't see why we can't say, yeah, Ireland does look like a colony in the 13th century, but it looks like a mother country in the 19th century. I don't see any conflict with that whatsoever. Because times change, outlooks change, and the historian has to be alert to those changes. One of the other challenges of writing a long history, or a history over a long period of time, is that you have to pay attention to your writing. I think all historians pay attention to your writing, to their writing. But this is different. This is not writing that monograph about the failure of the money bill in the 1750s and the ins and outs of patriot politics in the 1780s or whatever. You need to get a tone, and maybe even wolf tone, to your writing on occasion. But you need to get a tone which will engage the reader. It's not enough to write the sort of the computer textbook. And that's why I think probably the most difficult aspect is thinking myself out of the monograph and into a more accessible type of writing, which would hopefully keep the reader engaged for a very long period of time, from 430 to 2010. Because the reader, once you lose the reader, then they're gone. You know, the ambition was that people could open the book at just about any page and start reading. And that would be I think that was what I was trying to do. And to that end, I had to think a lot about just style, as well as patterns, as well as themes, and so on. Style had to be very important. The phrase, the turn, the way paragraphs are balanced, just the nuts and bolts of this, the architecture of a page, for example. I would spend time on that to get that sort of welcoming for the reader. Not that I expect them to agree with it, of course, but that would be impossible, but just that it would keep them reading and keep them sufficiently engaged, perhaps, as to disagree. The other thing you need is, apart from an accessible style, is a good chronology. Contrary to popular belief, historians are hopeless with dates. And without the Royal Irish Academy's New History of Ireland chronology sitting beside me, just to check what was happening, I would have been totally astray at very many points. Maybe that's where I should stop. Thank you very much.